Hello, this is Subhas. Today we are going to look at the pawns. If you remember from the previous lesson, we discussed about the layout of the chessboard and where all the chess pieces go on the chessboard. So just to kind of recap what we learnt in the previous lesson, we wanted to make sure that when we lay out the chessboard, on our extreme right over here it should be a white square. On the opponent who is sitting opposite me, on his or her extreme right, it should be a white square. The next important thing is to actually notice where the queens are placed. A white queen will always be placed on a white square, or a light colored square as we call it, and a black queen will always be placed on a dark square or a black square. Okay, so having got that out of the way, in today's lesson we would actually talk about the pawns, the little soldiers, how they actually move. As you can see, the board is already laid out with all the pieces in position before the start of a game, and let's actually look at the pawn moves. So the pawn, these are the pawns, 8 pawns over here, white pawns over here, and 8 black pawns over here. The pawn, if I take this particular pawn, which is a queen's pawn because it's actually sitting kind of opposite to the queen, so I kind of refer it to a queen's pawn. When it actually moves this way, it moves either 1 square or 2 squares. That is when it actually moves for the very first time. So you have a choice of actually moving the pawns 1 square, 2 square. But what you have to remember is, of course, I had to mention that when we play the game, the white always starts the game first, and then once the white starts the game, then that's followed by the black. So what I actually mean is the white makes the first move with any of the pieces over here, and then the black follows it by moving its black pieces over here, and then it alternates. So the white moves, the black moves, the white moves, and the black moves. So that's how it actually works. So as I explained, so if I choose any pawn, in this case I chose the queen's pawn. If you look at all these pawns, they haven't actually moved at all. If you look at the black pawns, they haven't moved at all. So for the very first time, when the pawn actually moves, if I take for instance the queen's pawn, it can move either 1 square or 2 squares. So if the opponent decides to move the pawn 2 squares for the very first time, he can do that. If he wants to move just only 1 square, he can do that. Okay, once the pawn has actually moved, then any subsequent moves has always got to be only 1 square. So let's illustrate this. So my opponent decided to move the pawn 1 square. Now it's my turn. I decide to move the pawn 2 squares. So I got to move it 1 square or 2 squares because I'm moving it for the very first time. I decide to move 2 squares. Right. Now it's the white's turn to move. Now any subsequent moves by this pawn, which is already moved, can only move 1 square. It cannot move 2 squares. Well, obviously it can't because there's already a black pawn over there already. Okay. So if I want to move, let's say I'm going to choose another pawn. Which pawn should I choose? Let's choose a pawn, a knight's pawn over here. So I decide to choose 2 squares because it's now the white turn. Remember, when the beginning of the game, the queen's pawn was actually moved 1 square. Then the black's turn, he decided to move the queen's pawn over 2 squares. Okay, now the white decided to move the knight's pawn. For the very first time, it moved 2 squares. So for the first time, it moved 1 square or 2 squares, but decided to move 2 squares. Okay. Now, the black's turn to move. It doesn't have to move the opposite, whatever the move was. It can move the pawn from somewhere else. So let's choose the rook pawn, because sitting next to the rook, the black decides to move just 1 square rather than 2 squares. It got a choice of moving 1 square or 2 squares, but it decided to move only 1 square. Right, now it's white's turn now. Now the white decide to keep on moving the knight's pawn. Now, because this pawn is already moved, any subsequent moves for this pawn will be only 1 square. So it can only move there. It cannot move over here. That's wrong. Okay, it can only move 1 square. From there on, it can only move 1 square at a time. So you just decide to move that 1 square. Similarly from here, let's say the black decide to move his rook pawn further. So because for the very first time he had the choice of moving 1 square, 2 squares, but he decided to move 1 square. Now he's trying to move this pawn again because it's his turn, the black's turn. He can only move 1 square. He cannot move 2 square. He can't move to that square because this pawn is already moved. So he can only move 1 square. So that's how the game is played. As you can see, the pawns move forward. Always move forward. They cannot move backwards. They cannot move sideways. This pawn cannot move sideways like this. It can only move forward. So each of the pawns can move only forward, vertically. Similarly, for the black side, the same thing with the pawns over here.